Level 3 of the Cateran Society's broadsword curriculum is sword and targe, or any other double weapon combination, but we generally teach it as sword and targe. If you'd rather focus on sword and dagger, sword and buckler, or even two swords, you can, but the basic curriculum is done through sword and targe. Obviously that is seen by a lot of people as a defining weapon of the Highland warrior. So we're going to be doing a lot of work with this guard position here, which is hanging guard with the sword and targe, and that is a guard that Page mentions and is also shown in the Pennycook sketches and is also shown in McBain's small amount of sword and targe material. Page tells us in his manual that the Highlanders mostly used the outside guard, but what we have found is that that hanging guard is actually very effective for a lot of the techniques, even in Page's system. A lot of them seem to flow more naturally from that hanging guard than from Page's outside guard. So although we are going to be using Page's outside guard, and we're going to be using the other guards you see in the Pennycook sketches, a lot of these techniques are going to be from this hanging guard that we associate with McBain and with the Pennycook sketches more than with Page. So the first technique that we're going to look at, lesson 1, it's just a basic attack and defense from the hanging guard. And this is somewhat in reference to Valville's sword and targe picture, which is much later than these other manuals. And Valville was this French fencing master that taught in Russia, and he has a picture of what he calls the guard of the Highlander, again showing that this hanging guard with sword and targe was seen as a basic defining sword and targe guard. He had actually spent some time in the Scottish Highlands and presumably had seen some people training by playing single stick. And what he shows is hanging guard, and the targe is actually held up by the head. And he's using this kind of homemade targe that is just strapped to the arm. With an actual traditional targe, we're going to hold it a little bit lower down by the elbow, like it's shown in the Pennycook sketches. But this idea of fighting from the hanging guard is probably what Valville saw as a single stick match. So what's going to happen is the opponent is going to cut to the inside high. We're going to parry, covering the head, and just step in and make a cut to the inside high. So it just illustrates a simple concept of fighting from the hanging guard. It's not a complex technique. So you'd actually start narrow in this version of the hanging guard. Okay, so you cut to my inside high. As you know, in Highland broadsword, attacking the legs is always risky because the opponent can shift and simultaneously counter to your head. As both Page and McBain tell us, it's safer to attack the legs when you have a targe or a buckler because you can cover your head when you go to attack the opponent's legs, thus preventing the counterattack. That's what we're going to show in lesson 2. Lesson 3 is going to be in close and command. This is the same concept that you've seen in lesson 10 of level 1 and in lesson 10 of level 2. So why we moved it to lesson 3 in sword and targe? Well, it's because when you have a second weapon, the concept of enclosing command takes on much more prominence. Sword and targe is an aggressive combination. You shouldn't think of the targe as being primarily a defensive weapon. You should think of it as being primarily a weapon of control. And so when you're actually fighting with sword and targe, one of your primary goals is to get a situation where you can parry with your sword, get a command with your targe, and then finish with your sword. A sequence we refer to as contact, control, kill. So this is going to be basically the same tactic as in lesson 10 of our regimental broadsword set. The opponent is going to attack to the inside high, but instead of simply parrying and countercutting, we're going to parry with the sword, stepping in on the parry, push the opponent's weapon to the side, bind the opponent's arm over with the targe, and then we're going to circle the sword all the way over for a large decapitating cut. So, now that's the same bind technique that you see in Page's sword and targe material as from an outside guard invitation. So what Page does is he lowers the sword and targe to the waist. When the opponent takes the bait and attacks, step in and parry, bind over with the targe, and finish. And that is very similar to the Turkish disarm technique, which is also found in Page, except since you have the targe, you don't need to hook with the pommel. However, we're choosing to apply that same concept from the hanging guard and without the invitation first. So again, the opponent attacks, and we bind the arm over to the side and finish. Now, the other command that you would frequently see in sword and targe is the lift. Page's version of how this happens is that I'm advancing on the inside guard as an invitation, and when my opponent takes the bait and attacks my outside, I block with the sword, lift with the targe, and thrust up between the ribs. We can do this same technique in bouting without having the invitation first. So if we're on that hanging guard and he cuts to my outside. So either the bind or the lift can be used in bouting, and you should practice both, but the bind is the version that we're choosing to illustrate the concept of enclosing command. Lesson 4 is Page's technique for how to escape a command. As he says, there isn't really any way you can escape once you're already bound over. But you can escape if you notice that the opponent is trying to bind you over. You have a moment in which you can get away. That moment is when the opponent parries with the sword instead of the targe. The fact that the opponent is parrying with the sword tells you that they want to do a command. So you come in for an attack, the opponent parries with the sword, you realize that something's going wrong and you need to get out of there, and you just run backwards and cut under at the same time. So let's say I'm making this as an outside cut, the opponent parries with the sword, I realize that the opponent is probably going to try to either lift or bind me. I run back and cut under. Page also tells us that you can escape a command by doing a back traverse instead of by springing off. So this is how that would look. And to do a back traverse, you're literally just stepping this way with your countercut. In the past, we sometimes showed that technique as a hanging slip, but that's far more complicated than necessary. What you actually need to do is just a back traverse. So when the opponent parries with the sword instead of the targe, you either run backwards and countercut or back traverse and countercut. Page tells us that there were basically two scenarios for Highlanders using the sword and targe. One is what he calls promiscuous combat. And he says that in the field of battle or promiscuous combat, the Highlander will attack so as not to be attacked. That's what we're going to show in this lesson, is the idea that you are simply going on the offensive and trying to overwhelm the opponent and kill them outright, because it is a kill or be killed situation. What we're going to do is, from Page's outside sword and targe guard, 1, 2, 3. The idea is that even if the opponent parries the first or the second attack, by the third attack they'll be overwhelmed. The other scenario that Page describes for sword and targe combat is a single combat. He tells us that in a single combat situation, the Highlander would only attempt to cut the opponent's arm. He then illustrates this with a somewhat elaborate scenario. I'll show that to you before I show you the lesson we're actually going to do. So we're on the outside guard. I run up to half sword distance, I change, and I slice the opponent's wrist on the inside, and then I run out. That's not the only way that you can cut the opponent's arm and end the fight without a fatality. Archibald MacGregor tells us in his lecture also that Highlanders in single combat would try to avoid killing the opponent. He uses the phrase anything but taking the life. And he says that this was done by cutting the arm inside or outside. What we're going to show is cutting the arm on the outside, because it's a much simpler scenario to train than the one Page is describing. Once you're used to the simple version, by all means you should try the version that Page describes. So we take a hanging guard arrow, and I just traverse off to the outside and throw a cut 2 at the arm. And the idea is just to inflict a wound that will make it so that my opponent can't keep fighting, but I don't have to kill him. And again, if you decide that you want to try out Page's version of this technique, well, not Page's version of this technique. If you want to try out Page's version of the concept of anything but taking the life, outside guard, I run in on the opponent, he's going to go for my outside. Now Page says you then change, which means to disengage over the tip. But because my targe is right there, I'm obviously going to also lift up his sword arm. And then I can slice his wrist from the inside and run back out of it. Lesson 7 is a very clever feint in Page's manual. You start on Page's outside guard, pitch to a hanging, and then cut 3 underneath. Now, when I say pitch to a hanging, I don't mean that you simply take a hanging guard. It has to look like this. So that upward movement, where you suddenly go to a hanging guard, creates the impression that you're attacking on the high line. The opponent will involuntarily flinch a little upwards, preparing for a parry. And then that gives you the opening to cut under and let out the opponent's bowels, as Page says. Matt is showing this as a fairly large upward movement. When you're doing this in a real bout, it will be a small upward movement. It's basically just a flinch, but it will happen. And that's the hanging pitch as a feint. Lesson 8 is McBain's counter to an attack with a Lochaber axe. This is also a counter you can use against an opponent using a sword and targe, but we're going to show it against a polearm so that you can see the way McBain illustrates it. He does not describe this in the text of his manual. This is just in an illustration. So, you're standing on your hanging guard, the opponent attacks to your inside high, you step into it parrying on your targe and thrust directly into the opponent's face or neck. Now, you have to do it this way where you step in on it because the Lochaber axe's cuts are so powerful because they make such a wide arc that if you try to step backwards and take the parry, it will quite possibly bash right through your parry, knock you to the ground, destroy your targe, and kill you anyway. So you want to step in on it so that you get into the opponent's distance before the cut can build up too much power, and you thrust simultaneously, which also makes it a time hit. This same counter, if the opponent has a sword and targe, let's say he's charging. This looks like that. You don't do it any differently than if the opponent has a Lochaber axe, or a two-handed sword, or whatever the case may be. You just step in on it, parry with your targe, thrust simultaneously. Lesson 9 is the Highland charge. This is the battlefield tactic that the Highlanders are probably most known for. Page refers to it as a field attack. He says that the Highlanders will run straight forward and they will either throw an outside or with a swinging and low inside they endeavor to let out the opponent's bowels. The idea is we're going to start in this position, which is from the Pennacook sketches, and we call this an open guard. It's basically the position to prepare for the charge. As you run forward, you're going to either, it's your choice, you're either going to throw a cut 2 or a cut 3 as you run by the opponent. Now, I want you to practice this lesson with a great deal of caution and do not do it quickly until you have a lot of experience, because since you're running, this is among the less safe techniques in the curriculum. I want you to do very, very slowly at first, but I'm going to show it at speed. Now, the whole idea of the Highland charge is that you're coming in at a run, shouting war cries and that kind of thing, and even if the opponent tries to do something to defend himself from your attack, there's every possibility that it won't work simply because you're running in and he can't know which attack you're going to do. This time, Matt is going to attempt to parry. Because the charging swordsman can change the line of the attack at will on the run, it's extremely difficult for the opponent to successfully defend himself by parrying. So how does the opponent defend himself if he has the presence of mind to do something smart? That's lesson 10. That's going to be our defense against the Highland charge. For this defense, we're either going to use McBain's hanging guard or another guard from the Pennacook sketches that people refer to as an underarm guard. I'm going to show this at first from the underarm guard. When the opponent charges, I'm going to step in on it, cut into it, bind, and finish. And if I do that from the hanging guard instead, it ends the same way. So you have to have the presence of mind to be ready with that underarm guard or that hanging guard to do a bind. The Pennicook sketches also show a lowered guard like this, and there's some contemporary pictures of Highlanders showing a medium guard. From either one of those, you can also counter the charge by dropping to one knee and thrusting up. But the standard version that we're showing is a bind from either the underarm or hanging guard.